Hello, folks. Welcome to our webinar today. My name is John Watson. I'm with the Evergreen Education Group and the Digital Learning Collaborative. Got three fantastic guests that will be joining the discussion momentarily. I just want to take a moment to set it up before they introduce themselves. If we've got a lot of folks that we've worked with over the years from all sorts of different types of online and hybrid and blended schools and programs. One of the things that every one of them has in common is they are using some sort of provider. Some of them are using more than one provider. Some of them are using a single provider. Some of them are creating a lot of their own materials. So there's that mix between what they might be building versus what they might be buying. But there's nobody out there that's not using a provider in some form or fashion within the digital learning world. So this discussion is about how to think about finding the right provider, how to find a provider that understands you and your needs in a way that's going to make for the ideal partnership. With that, I'm going to turn it over to a couple of, all three of our panelists to introduce themselves. You'll be hearing and you'll get a sense for the different perspectives that they bring. And I'm going to start with Dan Milan. Dan, can you share a little bit about yourself?
Sure, thanks, John. I'm a principal here in Arizona of an intentionally hybrid school. I come from 30 years in public ed in Pennsylvania. And we run a hybrid school where we are grades 6 to 12, and we run half days Monday through Thursday, and we're both grade levels.
Thank you, Dan. And we're going to come back to, I love when you said intentionally hybrid, and I love the hybrid model that Valor has. And we're going to be talking about that and how it plays into how you think about providers. Before we do that, Kelly, tell us about a little bit about yourself, please.
Thanks, John. I'm Kelly Schwartzky. I'm the lead teacher at Oasis High School in Santa Cruz, California. We're an independent study program that's part of a larger alternative ed program that's countywide. We serve about 140 students currently in multiple modalities. And then I help with hybrid learning and supporting the 1,000 students that are in our entire program. So sort of two parallel initiatives.
Excellent. Thank you, Kelly. And I'm going to be interested in hearing a little bit more. We're going to circle back to talk about how instruction and scheduling and other things work at both your schools. Before we do that, Gina, can you tell us about yourself and what you're doing at StrongMind these days?
Sure. Good afternoon. I'm Gina Little. I am the Senior Director of Special Programs for StrongMind. I've been in special education for 26 years in both a teacher, a leadership role as a principal, as well as a district office special education director. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you, Gina. As we're getting into the discussion, I want to mention that we are keeping an eye on the chat window. And so we're more than glad to take questions in through the chat. Dan, Kelly, Gina, if you see questions coming in through the chat that I missed, please feel free to address them in using the text function or to just address them in your comments. I want to start this discussion. So eventually we're going to talk about this provider question, right? That's the main focus of this discussion. But I think it's valuable to set up a bit more of a conversation about how instruction works at each of your schools. You're both at what we consider hybrid schools, intentionally hybrid schools, to use Dan's phrase. And I know you both might not quite use the same terminology, but you are mixing online and at least some on-site instruction. So I'd love to hear about instruction, a little bit more about your school, how you think about instruction, scheduling, how you use face-to-face time, online time, et cetera, those sorts of issues. Kelly, can we start with you and talk about Santa Cruz?
Sure. So at our site, we're in a community college campus. We do serve students who elect to dual enroll in college credit, and they take those classes face-to-face, hybrid, and online. Then our independent study program, I'm a teacher there, as well as I participate in leadership for our larger program. So I'm looking at things through multiple lenses at all times. Legislatively, the rule is that we meet with our independent study students once a week for approximately an hour. Traditionally, that had to be in person. And I think about 4 years ago, the state of California enacted legislation to allow us to do that virtually. And then in the last 2 years now, it is at least part of the meeting should be synchronous. So we might meet with them in Zoom. They might be using textbooks at home. They might be logged into an online class where we work with them. I think the wider net is personalized learning. So what that means is with each student, the mix is different. The elements are all the same, but the mix is largely personalized to their preference, teacher recommendation, and then the needs for which courses or material they might need. So every student has an ed plan, so to speak, around hybrid learning.
I love the way you went into that explanation of personalized learning, because I do think in the ed tech world, there's this definition of personalized learning that I feel is quite narrow. It's like, well, you had this trouble with this one math problem, so we're going to give you this math problem in a slightly different way. And you're talking about personalizing really to that student, the entirety of that student, and with the education plan that you're talking about. We might come back to that because I think it's really valuable. Before we do that, Dan, tell us about the intentional hybrid elements at Valor.
Yeah, thanks. I do say intentionally because I know hybrid got kind of beat up over during COVID, and the whole name of it kind of got tossed around. So the intentional part of it is really what I think when people do it well, they focus on what online has to offer and what the humans have to offer, and what the real power of a human being is, and a teacher and a mentor and the relationships, and what the real power of online is. And for us, online delivers content. For us, the number one is set the foundation. So online sets the foundation of knowledge, and then the humans set the ceiling, which should be as high as the student can go. So when you look at those two aspects, it really kind of divides hybrid up or online into, okay, this is what we can get from online. We need lots of formative data, lots of information how they're doing. The humans need time to read the data, adjust to it, and then in the classroom, elevate the learning as they see it's needed. And I think to Kelly's point, that the word we use, personalized, is a good word for it. We use the word empower. We empower students and families and staff, as a matter of fact, to make the decisions that are best for the student at the time. It's based on data, like Kelly was describing. Like, we're not going to send someone over to college right now if they're just barely surviving high school class. That's not the right move. We're going to have to build up some skills. But if based on what the student is doing, we offer a continuum. They could actually come on site just for our tutoring pieces, or they can come on site for the classroom. So the way we set it up is that the tenets of our program are high-level in-class activities, elevated 4Cs work, online content that is delivered and accessible at any time, anywhere, and then high-level tutoring on top of that when you need it with the human to actually tutor them. So to do that, we set it up. Middle school comes to school for 8 to 12, Monday through Thursday, and the high school comes from 12 to 4. The research has shown that high school students aren't great at getting up in the morning. It's not good for their biology to actually be in that system. So we let them come anytime between 8 and 12 to get that tutoring that they need, or that we ask them to come get. And then Fridays, it was Monday through Thursday, Fridays are just for relationship building. So the online content is flowing through all of this. And then on Fridays, it's clubs, activities, things like that, what they want to come together.
I was taking a couple of notes there, Dan, because there's a couple of things I want to come back to. But before we do that, I want to go back to Kelly, and then Gina, I'm going to go to you to comment on the strong mind perspective on some of these issues. But it occurs to me that even the way we set up this conversation, equated online to the content piece versus the communication and instruction piece. But Kelly, that's not what happens at your school, right? Because you don't your students don't have to come to the building nearly as much as Dan's students do, correct? So
Correct.
your online and face-to-face mix is a little bit different. Can you talk about that?
Well, I can give you an example of sort of my school day. So my students have a set appointment each week with me at the same time. They often have to change it because many of them are working. During that appointment, usually at intake, but also every week, I'm very flexible. Every teacher isn't, but I am. I let them choose week to week if they want to meet virtually or if they want to come to my desk on campus. And then the agenda of that meeting is set. We set that together. So it might be, we're going to look at your college class if you're in college. It might be, let's look at your government class because I can see that you're struggling in this unit. It might be, what are you interested in learning? Do we need to get you an elective or try and find some kind of plug-in group or community? Because speaking to Dan's point, we don't offer any of that in independent study, but our larger alternative education program is rich with opportunities for students to plug in. So a lot of what I'm doing is just trying to manage resources with students, but always including them in the thought and coaching process, because they can learn government later, but they have to learn how to learn before they graduate. So a lot of it is dialogue, much like what we're doing now, which is the thought process, the metacognition. Is this online course working? Would you rather have government with a textbook? It's always, pivoting week to week and giving them lots of chances to make changes based on data, the same as what Dan said. It's just that we can do it at a more micro level. In our larger program in the classrooms, it's similar, but more, middle of the road, because they can't personalize or pivot as much if you have 24 students. But the philosophy is the same. The teacher that's in our building has 24 students in a day program, and they have part of their day to work in an online class. So there's just a lot of different ways that they're accessing it. But for me, it's very dialogue centric.
I'm going to come back
Diane?
to a couple of things. Yes, and there's a lot to build on there. Before we do that, I haven't given Gina a chance to get involved in the conversation. Gina, I'd love to hear about how StrongMind thinks about some of these issues. I know that StrongMind's been thinking about online and hybrid schools for a long time, and Dan mentioned the idea that hybrid got a bad name during the pandemic. In some places, online got a bad name during the pandemic as well. And
Absolutely.
it's really valuable for some folks to understand that organizations like StrongMind have been working in this space for well over a decade. Can you just talk about how StrongMind thinks about some of these issues?
Absolutely. So first, as I was sitting and listening to Dan, I wanted to say, wearing my special education hat, all the things that Dan is talking about and Kelly's mentioned as well are all examples of great teaching, which students with disabilities or any student with learning differences, let's say any student benefits from, right? That personalized learning, personal to that individual student. And StrongMind takes that into consideration. Some of the things that they have already in our LMS is the ability that students can, or teachers can omit assignments for certain students. If that's not part of their personalized learning plan, we don't need to have those questions in. Students can have, again, not only students with disabilities, all students who may have different learning needs, they can have assignments that are different than what their peer has next to them. A teacher can upload something different in entirety for particular students. There's just a lot of ways to differentiate on our platform that I see everyday students being successful with.
A couple of things that you're saying are particularly interesting to me. One is the idea that came up during, especially in the early days of the pandemic. There was a lot of discussion about students with special needs and how well they were going to do online, and I think there was a lack of general understanding that a lot of students with special needs do really, really well in the online environment, because a lot of the accommodations around extra time, extra resources, things like that are just inherent in an online instructional model. So they work out really, really well. The other thing is this idea that that special needs students are getting these accommodations, but as you're referencing, Gina, every student can benefit from some level of individualized instruction. We did some work years and years ago that was trying to analyze different cost structures within online schools, and one of the things that became apparent was the idea that for traditional face-to-face school, the additional cost of addressing accommodations and special needs can really be extremely large. For online schools, a lot of those additional accommodations are really, they're inherent in what they're doing. They're really not additional at all. So the way you're addressing those issues, I think is so central to how we think about instruction in these online and hybrid schools. I want to go back, and Kelly, I want to start with you. You described the way you work with a student, especially in that 1 hour a week, right? And you were talking about, I think you mentioned helping a student think about her community college course and helping another student think about like a government course or something like that. And I think a lot of people in traditional schools and not just schools, but state education agencies and legislatures, et cetera, they don't understand the idea that you're playing a completely different role with these students than a quote unquote teacher, right? Because you're addressing everything that student is doing. What can you explain a little bit more, like how this is a role that your school creates? So presumably every student has a version of a Kelly Schwartzky, right? What does that look like? You're still muted.
I know you were excited about that. So every student in independent study does have a core teacher. We make an effort to build relationships. So for instance, if a student came to school and I was with another student, we make sure our students know the other teachers and feel comfortable with that. We do increasingly lately, we try and make relationships with other people on campus. So it's not just drive through with one person and they're dependent on me. I think something that Gina said reminded me of a helpful perspective somebody gave me, I think at the DLAC conference probably, was that in independent study, but increasingly in traditional classrooms, teachers are more like a special education specialist. So my student has an IEP, an individual education plan that they qualified for. And I work with that specialist who is, I think, teaching me more than I'm teaching either the student or her. But she has access to the online classes. So she sees data. She contacts me and says, how are things going for this student? I say, this is a particular area of concern. And then she works with that student on that content, either virtually through the course or on pencil paper in person. So we're really trying to create a streamlined team that's reinforcing and catching any balls that are getting dropped along the way. But what I think of it more as what we call it a special education specialist. That means that you're paying attention to everything, not just the core courses that you're teaching. You're really checking in on all levels of social, emotional, learning, assessment, output, a sense of self-efficacy, all those pieces kind of all the time, because we're trying to teach students how to take that with them. But again, Gina, so many strategies that I find work online, hybrid, in person are coming out of special education. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because there is the perspective by some that so many students suffer during our just related, we had to go virtual due to weather, due to the pandemic. But there are so many success stories that might just not be out there about students in special education programs in this setting.
Agreed.
Absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead, Gina.
Kelly, you said it perfectly. It really, unfortunately, the pandemic, which affected everyone, what came out of that, as we all sit here know, is that, oh my goodness, virtual learning, it's a mess. But, I can have a true appreciation for how we started this webinar with Dan's point of, real hybrid, right? Not done in as an emergency.
Mhm.
And, I've worked virtually for some time now, before the pandemic, and it's so, I love now working more, talking more to general educators after the pandemic and seeing where they feel we could have, and I'm just saying we as educators could have done a better job in coming out of districts in a virtual manner, whereas places like Strong Mind, as an educational management company, we were able to never skip a beat, and really hone in on student need. We talked earlier, I think, John, you mentioned the built-in accommodations. You take that, and Kelly, you take that social piece that is so hard sometimes to navigate face-to-face, and you take a student out of that, of having to, okay, what do I say when this person might not be kind, or what do I say here? And it puts the emphasis back on quality instruction and students getting what they need. And then, I know so many families that opt for virtual, and then they do their social emotional learning based on online curriculum, or, on the weekends with whatever the student chooses to do in an area of interest. So yes, on all aspects, taking that social piece out that is sometimes so hard to navigate, no matter who you are, right? And letting students just be available and ready for quality instruction.
Speaking of that social piece, Dan, a little while ago, you mentioned what Valor does on Fridays, and I think you said relationship building. What does that look like?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's one of the tenets of our entire school. So as I looked at the schedule, it's actually one of those things where I used pretty much every provider you could think of. And when I had the opportunity to come out here and start up a school and do it with this, so the challenge set was, you want to run a hybrid school, what schedule would you like? And that's a daunting question, right? So the first thing you have to do is, like I said before, is outline what the humans are doing and what you want online to do. And when you look at what the humans are going to do, relationships have to be the very top of that discussion. Right next to, and slightly elevated above, what are you elevating out of the knowledge they just got as a teacher? What are you elevating? Say, okay, it can't all be that important. What's the real application of skills that are coming from that knowledge you just got? And then how do you do that in a way that is both open to the student and the teacher, they can learn together? So that relationship piece happens on a daily basis in the classroom. But then that piece on Friday, what I designed, what we came up with was, we need a day where we don't necessarily have to talk about just school. Like, we want to say, let's talk about that. And now, to be clear, the first part of that day is tutoring. So 8 to 10 on that Friday is still tutoring time. So when the kids need help, I got to make sure they get the help they need. So they're in there with their teachers working on content. After that is our time where they get to I run my student government class. We have things like choir. We have the typical things you'd like to see, yearbook kind of activities, and just kids out playing. You wouldn't believe how popular Foursquare is, John. Like, you would think Foursquare would be an elementary school game. I have 18-year-olds out there just competing unbelievably at Foursquare. So we'll run Foursquare tournaments, basketball tournaments. Things are just not academically related, but just based on getting to know each other as humans, so that when the tough times come, when the content is, the important thing to go over, that there's a foundation of respect and trust among the staff.
Kelly, you were nodding along. Was there anything you wanted to add to that? We're about to switch gears and talk about working with providers, but I just want to see if Kelly, if there's anything you want to add, and if you don't, I'll quote you.
Well, that's challenging. Well, I like how I've always liked how Dan's school manages so many different pieces in a way that I think it really changes the way people think of hybrid learning, which is you're online or you're with the teacher, when really what you're talking about is 15 different modalities, a structure, but also students' opportunity to get ahead, get support, and have that rich social emotional interaction, because those skills are our responsibility and they are challenging in any format, which I think transitions to whatever John was about to say that I'm sure is appropriate and helpful to the conversation.
Yeah, I want to hear the quote.
The quote that I've been finding myself using a number of times recently, which I'm pretty sure was a Kelly Schwartzky quote originally, was along the lines of, as a teacher, as a school, are you teaching kids or are you teaching content? And I love that quote and I love that concept, because to me, it is the epitome of the difference between the types of schools that you're both in and a lot of the other schools that we work with, that really take, it's a mindset. And I feel like I have a different lens on this as well, because I have reason to have some exposure and insights into some pretty big universities, and you see it even more accentuated at the university level. There's very few K-12 schools and teachers who would say, oh no, I just want to teach content. That they still do it, I believe. And when you think about it, I mean, that's the way the whole state assessment accountability system is set up entirely on that. At the post-secondary level, there are absolutely, it's dominated by professors who are like, I'm going to go up there and lecture because I'm the most brilliant person in the world on this, and these students need to hear from me for the next hour. It's really just a shame that they only have an hour with me to listen to. And that's very common. And I do think that attitude exists within, especially at the high school level. I mean, you don't see that in elementary schools, at least I hope you wouldn't. But that's still a thing within more of K-12. Again, not just the schools, but really as it's set up as a system. And what your schools and others, especially in our space, are doing is really breaking that whole paradigm in really, really, really positive ways. And what you two are talking about, and from your school's perspective, and Gina is talking about from the Strong Mind perspective, is how do you do that in an operational way? And I believe it's actually really, really hard to do within the constraints of a traditional mainstream school, with funding requirements and time requirements and accountability requirements, all those sorts of things, just in the way Dan and Kelly, you two are talking about the different roles that these teachers play. And, like the idea of, Dan, your Friday, boy, that would be a hard thing to do at a mainstream high school, right? And so you've got the ability to do it.
Yeah, you'd be surprised, John. I think, when I was in Ephrata, we were trying to figure out, Ephrata was always focused on the application of skills. We were elevating. It was my responsibility to kind of, what role does offline play in all that? And we created our flexible learning cohorts. When you start creating cohorts to test out models, you can do a lot within that space. Actually, in some ways, the public schools are given a decent amount of breadth to say, all right, we know you have the kids. What are you going to do with them in this space? So I just think it takes an innovative mindset to say, what do you want out of it? What are we willing to give up time-wise if we're going to gain all this relationship and elevated content as opposed to just minutes in the scene? Yeah,
agreed. And just to backfill a bit for those who in the audience, when you mentioned Ephrata, you're talking about the district that you were in Pennsylvania for several decades, where you were putting some of these same ideas into place, but in a mainstream district environment as opposed to your current charter school environment.
Right. Yeah, that's
John,
how
I
they
just
told me.
Yeah,
I wanted
Kelly.
to respond to something that you just said that got me thinking. I taught in mainstream schools for the bulk of my career, much longer than I have in an alternative space. And I also teach in a credential program. And speaking to your point about mindset, I would say that Wayne Gretzky was not the greatest hockey player of all time until somebody put skates on him. And it was a principal in 2001 who said to me, I would like you to pilot something and you can have whoever you want on the team, and gave me the opportunity to make some mistakes and gently guided me into choosing an innovator and a change agent when she said, I need you to invite some people that are reluctant to the idea of online and virtual learning, and encouraged me to have a group of people to talk about and begin that shift of mindset rather than just choosing a teacher like myself who was like, of course I'll do it. It's interesting, it's innovative. She encouraged me to bring a group of people. And then when I met you and worked with Evergreen, I started understanding the importance of having not just teachers, but operations, technology, leadership, counselors, special ed in those small pilots, so that we started saving time by building that mindset exponentially. So we would always want someone like a Dan in the group and a Gina in the group, but we did invite people who were very reluctant or had no experience, so that we could build that mindset internally before we started managing that message with families and kids.
Yeah, great points. And I don't want to sound like we never see it within mainstream schools.
Of course.
I still we see those pockets of innovation, and it is a scale challenge, I think, and it's also the part of the reason that schools like yours and others that StrongMind is working with are so valuable as exemplars. We are about a little past halfway through our time. As Denise, Kelly mentioned in the chat window, if there's questions, please drop them in. I do want to switch gears, and Dan and Kelly, I wanted to talk about your experience with working with providers. I'm not asking any deep details, good or bad, about specific providers. It's more about high-level discussion. I'm wondering what you find generally in our digital learning field. There are endless content and technology providers for physical schools. There aren't nearly as many for online schools and courses. There aren't many at all that are explicitly focused on hybrid. I'm wondering how you think about your relationships with a provider. What are the questions that you ask? Let me start with that, actually. What are the questions that you ask of a provider to better understand their mindset?
I go. I'll go. John, you're supposed to call on us. I wasn't ready. So for me, it's a question of, well, and I will say again, I think I've used pretty much all of it over time, and I think that strategy is probably the least effective. Of having too many at one time, because it ends up confusing your parents or students, and sometimes when kids are really struggling, it's just another excuse to say, well, this didn't work. So for me, the question I ask is, how far can you take us with what you have? So your online content provider, in my opinion, needs to be someone who can handle rigorous online work that can be done. Credit recovery, summer school, your lab settings, all those things that are going to happen within any school, and whatever, even if you don't have it set up, can they take you there when the time comes? As the innovator in your district, you need to be asking the question, who could do this for me? And now the next question, and how I landed in Arizona, was that I was asking the question, the pain point I ran into when doing all these things. I had the lab settings, the fully virtual school. We had an off-site online lab for kids who were recovering credit, wouldn't want to be the building. So we did all those things. And the next question was, how do we adjust the actual teaching in the school? And to that point, there was no provider in the field that was linking what was happening online to what was happening in the classroom, to running a hybrid setting. And until panel is StrongMind actually put it out there. They said, what if you had a school and we had hybrid lesson plans built in for you that were based on station rotation and independent study and collaborative study and, you know, working in the teacher seminar times. And in this setting, they were the only ones who provided it. And if your content provider can't offer that breadth, that entire stretch of land, then I don't think they're ready for the present and the future. They might be able to get you the present, but they might get you the future. I mean, of course, they need to have lots of formative data flowing over. That's got to be a must. But those are like ground zero things you have. But the number one question I have is, where are we now? What can you solve for now? And what can you solve for me moving forward?
Thank you, Dan. Kelly, I remember a bunch of years ago, I put the question to you about how you were working in a hybrid setting. What were the types of things what were the tools that you were using? And I remember you said something like, well, I was working on spreadsheets at 11 o'clock last night, essentially doing that.
What are the
questions what are the questions you ask of potential providers?
Well, based on that, obviously, I'm always very curious about the reports that I can get, because early days I was hand doing them for large scale. So that's always interesting to me. And, you know, most providers have very similar course content and course delivery and that kind of thing. But I do find that some are more intuitive at getting data out. But the first question that I ask if we're, I don't know if you're talking about the first time they present to us or working with them, but my first question is always, who is my liaison? Who are you assigning to be leech-like with me, that I can talk to, that I can ask questions, that I can make suggestions? And some providers immediately know what I mean, and they might call it a curriculum and instruction specialist. They might have a different project manager, but it's someone that I can build a relationship with, because I can't possibly build relationships with students and staffs and leadership if I can't build a relationship with the provider. And I can't build a relationship with a provider if there isn't my equivalent asking me questions and answering questions that I have. So that is my first question: is what is your structure and process for providing a liaison who is as interested in my student success as I am, and not just a contract renewal? So the first provider that we worked at, I won't name, but they did assign someone who was very interested in seeing student work and really understanding at the granular level, what does this look like for the user? What could we be doing differently? What is the student struggling with? I mean, I was sending, you know, examples of student work, and I found that to be helpful to the provider, in that I will overlook certain things because I feel like they're invested. And it also helped with conversations, to Dan's point, about where are you going as a provider? What is your vision? What do you wish you could do that you're working on? What do you wish a client could do? And those types of conversations, similar that we have to our students, really speak to that relationship piece, more so than just the details of the technology. And there aren't a lot of providers who understand the hybrid space. So maybe Gina will speak more to how that's different, but that's my main question. I don't like them to present their product. I mean, it's either aligned to the standards or it's not. They're all fairly similar, other than, you know, some of the things that StrongMind's doing that's more innovative. But I really want to know, are you interested in my program and these students? Do you care if Jose is graduating? Because if you do, then I think we can work well together. I don't think that's a really common approach when meeting with a provider. And then after that stage, once we're in contract, then I definitely ask, who is on the team that we're going to meet with regularly? Either once a week, once a month, whatever. Who at the different levels of operations, curriculum, instruction on your end am I going to be talking to, so that we can pivot quickly, particularly in a pilot? That's the beauty of having these multiple pilots, so that we can fine tune things before we jump it out to people that are going to get frustrated and then just quit. Those are my questions, or more about people than content, actually.
And I would love to chime in here because I feel very lucky to work for a company that has the experience to not only work with virtual schools, but the hybrid model as well. There are a lot of providers. I used to work at other ones that, really were online, but never really had an option or a conceivable option to doing hybrid. And then Kelly, what you're speaking to about who is invested in my student, I definitely, and I feel like in my role, and again, I'm an educator, and definitely never have been on the sales side of things, but it's just a natural collaboration with StrongMind. I'm an educator. I'm not, I'll be able to talk to potential clients, but I really talk to them based on what their school needs, what their students need, what makes their job easier. And then what we're able to do kind of sells itself. I do know that StrongMind does provide, your sales liaison and all of that. And honestly, I've never really had to get into the nitty gritty with that, but I know that I've been fortunate to be able to work with schools and leaders and teachers in my role outside of, trying to sell, but just really talking about what do you need for your diverse learners? What questions can I answer? Oh, you need a report on attendance. Oh, I know, this is a great way to run it. Formative assessments, where you want to put your exit tickets, all of that. I'm lucky, I feel like, because I could talk to it just from an excited user versus I don't know, I don't take care of that. But as an educator, I'm able to share what is exciting as an educator to our clients.
And as you're referencing, I do think there's such a critical element of the understanding that StrongMind has. And you've referenced this, but I just want to echo it, the fact that you've been working with online schools for a long time, the fact that you've been working with hybrid schools now, and also took the time and invested in understanding emerging hybrid schools pre-pandemic. That understanding, I think, is so critical. I know when a school feels like they want to be able to explain, I believe, to a provider the specifics of the school, but you don't want to be in a situation where you have to educate them about the basics of different flavors of digital learning, right? And especially post-pandemic, there's a lot of new providers moving into this space, and not that hard to sound like you know what you're talking about, but it is hard to actually know what you're talking about. I want to go back to, I had this question teed up about what are examples of successful provider partnerships and why. Dan and Kelly, I know you both touched on this a little bit, but I'm hoping we could go a little bit deeper. And Dan, I'll start with you. What are some examples that maybe you haven't touched on yet about what does success look like?
Well, Kelly nailed it right off the bat, and I hadn't thought about it as much. In my current role, because I'm the beginning and end of this, like this is the school. When I was handling the virtual side of things, that first contact liaison, that person between me and the provider, was the essential element. It is true, because the content was generally, as you said, similar across. Some were easier to navigate, some were not. But generally it was going to land in a similar space. So it was the human relationship you had with the provider that really made the difference, quite honestly. Now, what made me jump around was some of the differentiation between the standard curriculum and credit recovery. And, when I had to run my lab that ran from 8 a.m. to 8:30 at night in 4-hour sessions, that was, for kids who either dropped in, dropped out, that kind of thing. that required a unique touch. So I needed a provider who could handle adjusting a curriculum that was easily adjusted. So that I could go in and add things, take them out, remove them, and be able to control that content that way. I had one provider, it was almost impossible. They were saying, no, you can't have access to that. And then I minimize the use of that person, of that provider. And then when I find someone I can actually control how my teachers interact with it or my learning coaches interact with it, that's what has been successful for me. The more control I can have, the better off I am.
Thank you, Dan. Kelly, additions to what you said earlier about successful partnerships?
Yeah, just to extend what I think Dan was saying, that reminded me, there is a temptation to grab lots of providers. And I think Michael Fullen said that there's a danger of innovation collision, which is where products look great, but the implementation becomes so messy that it actually is counterproductive to staff and students. So there is some element of an attractive provider can address multiple levels, like Dan said. So for instance, mastery. Increasingly, we have students who want to take a mastery level course. So if they can meet the exam at a certain percentage, they move on. We have an increasing need for diagnostic, particularly with math and English, because a student can complete English 1 and Math 1, but yet isn't ready for English 2 or Math 2. And it's very difficult to assess where the holes are. So being able to have those diagnostic courses are really helpful, particularly for students that are in credit recovery. We don't have a lot of time to figure out where the holes are or how to help them get credit quickly. So having multiple versions of the same, I always use government as an example, having access to 4 levels of government. So mastery, credit recovery, meaning that we assume they've had some of the content before, it's not first exposure. And then also the college prep courses that in California are required by UC to have a certain designation, so that we don't have those students, we don't have tracks. Every student with every course, we can decide which of those levels is most appropriate. They might need the college prep course, but they also might need a credit recovery in a different class. So being able to find that type of variety with one provider has become really important, not required, but important. Additionally, I think what Dan also touched on too, for example, 2 years ago, I contacted one of our providers and said, we are desperate for career technical ed classes. We need introduction to business. We need personal finance. We need some application outside of just the content, because we have a responsibility. These students are going to encounter online access and learning at a bank, to apply to work at a department store, in college. We can't graduate them without some experience, which has been kind of a priority for us, which is also helpful when you go into emergency virtual learning, because it's not the first time, as we saw in the pandemic, students have experienced it. So even if they don't take a whole course, we also like if a provider offers maybe a partial experience. Maybe it's an introduction to a concept and it's not a full semester course, but it's like an online workbook to some extent, where students can practice learning these skills before they're in government, if that makes sense. So those are some of the real granular level things that we might discuss with a provider. And when they ask questions like, what courses do you think you're going to want to see, or what courses are working? What did we get rid of that you wish you had back? Those types of questions are really make students and our staff feel helpful. And obviously providers that ask to speak to students in a focus groups also has a helpful impact.
I love hearing from students, and there's no better way to understand what a school is doing than to hear from those students. Kelly, you raised your segue was perfect, because I was about to ask Gina in your position as a provider. What do you think are those essential questions to ask, building on some of what Kelly said?
Again, wearing my special education hat, as well as just thinking about diverse learners. The questions that I get excited if they're asked, or I always want to share, are the things that are like built in to our program that all learners can access. And I think about that for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, the student diverse needs, parents who have chosen to be a learning coach or to their student, and not they obviously might not just be an educator. So what does the program naturally bring to families and students? And, you know, I get excited that, you know, with our diverse learners that we have the ability to offer text to speech, again, working in certain other educational management companies. Not all of them had the ability to do text to speech, as well as have a translation to several different languages. There are transcripts for videos, which again, students are able to go back. Family learning coach can go back. Okay, you know, this was what's said in this video. Is this an area that we're struggling? Let's rewatch. Let's look at the transcript. You know, let's refresh our thinking. Can that help me? Those are the things that I get excited as a provider to share with potential clients or clients that are have been working with us and have questions. Every now and again, again, I work with some managed public schools that we have, as well as other clients that work with Strong Mind in other ways. And I get super excited when I'm invited to talk to school districts in just ways that we could differentiate. And, you know, those are the things that I want to share in my role, because there's so many students out there that need things that sometimes you don't even think that they need until you know what's capable. So those are the things that I get excited to share. And when if somebody asks about, I love to go into great detail about. So I think Dan and Kelly said it best, like they're really thinking, the questions they're thinking about are things that on the receiving side, we already have answers for. So that's always exciting.
Yeah. One point I want to echo that you alluded to is when you as a provider or anybody's talking to a Dan or a Kelly, they have a really solid idea of what they're trying to accomplish. They've been doing this for a long time. They're in established schools. There's a lot of folks who don't know that, and they may be new. Their school or program may be new or may be rapidly evolving. They may be new to the field, and I think there's such a valuable role for an experienced provider to have this give and take around helping to frame the right questions that school may not have fully considered, and that's an incredibly valuable role. I'm going to go in a moment to lightning round, have each of you give a 30-second or so final thought to leave the audience with. Before I do that, I want to mention that Strong Mind will be sending an email out with a white paper on this topic to everybody who's been registered for this webinar. It'll get a little bit deeper into some of these same topics that we've been talking about. With that, let's wrap up with your final thoughts. I'll go Gina, and then Dan, and then Kelly. Gina, what would you like to leave the audience with?
I think that what I would like to leave them with is really what we started with about real hybrid education, and the fact that in hybrid as well as online, we're able to, as providers, as Strong Mind, able to meet teachers, students where they're at, and families, and provide them with some neat built-in accommodations, as well as just being able to service students like Dan's school, and get excited about hearing about Kelly's program as well.
Thank you, Gina. Dan?
I would start with, like, you know, we've seen that the Education 4.0 has been described to us as, the application of skills using the dispositions to hold it all together. The provider you use, and you will need some provider moving forward, it's going to have to answer those questions for you. Like, how are we going to leverage the capacity of humans and the potential of online and hybrid, even if it's hybrid as in get face to face with students while they're doing online work, some version of hybrid is that solution. And the quicker we get to it, the more we can get better at refining all the different models that are going to be available to everybody. And if you want more information, make sure you give me a shout as to how we are defining hybrid out here at Ballard.
We're going to put up a contact slide with your contact information momentarily. Yeah, thank you, Dan. Kelly, last word.
Success in a hybrid environment is the same as it has been in school forever. It involves teams and pilots and focus groups and student voice and relationship. And whether you're looking for a provider or you're in one, it's the same as any relationship. Is this working for us? Is it going to continue to work for us? Do I feel heard? And is this meeting our needs? So that's how I look at it. But at the end of the day, it's all still about relationships. Teaching, learning, delivery, hybrid, all of it is about relationships.
Totally agree. Well, thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Gina. As we're closing, we'll put up the slide with your contact information. And folks who are watching live as well as recording, feel free to reach out to any of us. We're also going to have lots of these folks at DLAC, the Digital Learning Annual Conference, which will be starting online a week from today and in Austin, Texas in 2 weeks. So we hope to see some of you there as well. Again, Dan, Kelly, Gina, thanks very much. Hope to have you on again soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thanks.